This introductory video is a short overview of what my research has amounted to over the past, I guess I've been doing this for about 7 years. And what I really did, and you'll see a slide in here that explains that, is I kind of got the cart going before the horse. You know how it is when you identify the problem, and then you kind of grope for a while as to what exactly may solve that problem. And it eventually led me back to university to get a bachelor's degree in multimedia journalism, and then I was accepted into the PhD program for public administration at Florida Atlantic University. So this is the year that I expect to be graduating, and I should be finished my dissertation by May this year. And so this comprehensive overview is covering the engineering and that theoretical development of the MOCSIE systems. And I called it the MOCSIE systems because it was too complex to just keep referring it to you as the project, and because it's multiple projects all embedded into one. And I've worked on this a lot with my partner and husband, Ed Rowe, who is the Associate Director of Equal Opportunity Programs at Florida Atlantic University. And he is African American, and it's important that you know that, because as you will see through this theoretical development, the issues and concerns which we have struggled with together have included race, gender identity, and socioeconomic circumstances. So let's get started with this overview. Where it's going at this point in time is to answer this question. The most legitimate question to be asked in a democracy is, how can people get control of the government? And control, that was Schatznyder who said that in 1948. And control of the government is not as simple as it originally sounds when you think of, well, if you win an election, then you have your victory. It's not that way. And that's why my PhD is in public administration, because we will cover through this complex process here exactly what it means to be controlled. So over the years, I've finally come down on my dissertation phase to this diagram here, which is 4 different complex layers of the MOCSIE systems. Each came about for various unique reasons. And so what it really starts to do, and where everything begins, is building this new kind of institution. And that's, well, like I said, I got the cart before the horse, because I came back to this as my starting point, whereas I originally was working as an activist, I was originally working in politics, and then I started developing the systems that might be necessary on a technological basis. But the ultimate goal, of course, is to win elections. And that's really why we're focusing on how to get there from A to Z, so to speak. The MOCSIE systems comes first, and I call this section A. And you'll see this banner across the top that explains the progression of where we are in this overview video. And but section A is building the MOCSIE systems. The systems development is section B, and that was really what I started working on when I started a PhD program. The transformational leader and organizational development, organizational behavior is something which came in very late in the game as well. But the purely political elements is where I thought I was going to start, but really what that is that's the end point. That's where we end. And that's really what is important about here as we go through this video. But really what we're after, of course, is policy change. It's not about just winning an election if you can't change policy. And we learned that with the election of President Obama, is that President Obama wanted to change a lot of policy. And he won the election, but that wasn't enough. And so that's what we really need to understand here, is what it takes to come back to this. Once we've won an election, we still haven't won the victory, because the real end goal is obscured in this process here, but I want you to keep that in mind. So let's start with section A2, an infinite number of small groups. This was, if you're going to design a new kind of an institution, what kind of an institution do you want? We have an institution called democracy. It was kind of created and became a very popular thing in style in the 1700s. And so we got this democracy. We got democracies all over the Western Hemisphere fairly quickly. But things aren't working for us. And so what we've come back to is this idea that we need to start working with a different kind of institution. Frederick Thayer is the person that I follow on this theory here. In 1973, he wrote his book, An End to Hierarchy and End to Competition. And he condemned hierarchy, and he went and talked about how things that really get done, when things really do get done, they get done as a result of people working informally in small groups. And so how do you institutionalize that? How do you create an institution that favors those types of, that germinates in and creates an environment where those kinds of organizations, those kinds of small groups can germinate. And what you have to do at the end of the day is avoid hierarchy, because hierarchy seeks power, and as soon as you have a hierarchy seeking power, these small groups become dominated by other forces. And so we want consensus building, and this is what Frederick Thayer talked about, is consensus building only happens in these small groups. I've done a lot of work on this regard, and the MOCSIE Systems webpage, I would refer you to the web domain that I've been accumulating my material. It's not as nicely organized, and that's why this video is important that you watch this first, because the webpage has grown organically and has been developed piece by piece by piece as I've attended conferences and as I've written papers and I've studied the research of others. So on the webpage here, you'll see this brochure, and this brochure was a product of one conference that I went to back in December of 2012, and that's really helpful to understand the small group idea, so I'm not going to spend any more time on that. So let's go to the part about understanding power. An understanding of power is what stops and stands in the way of these small groups. So once we figure out a way to form these small groups, how can we divest that power from the hierarchies down into these small groups? How can we legitimize the power of the small groups and delegitimize the power of hierarchy, where power has been held onto and continues to be held onto? So let's try and understand power a little bit. Representation in the United States is not working. We're supposed to have a representative democracy, and this is an idea that came out in the 1700s, is that everybody can't have a vote. That's too complicated when a nation is as big as the United States. So we have a representative democracy, but representative in the United States is no longer representative of the population. So the problem is with this homogeneity and hierarchical power, and so I'll point out that as a problem, and then I will refer you. But the global elite are leveraging a worldview threat, and that's how they manipulate power. So we're going to get into that as well. The film that I've done on that, a short video clip, is residing at this location here on the home page. It's right at the top. For the foreseeable future, I hope it stays there, but if it's not there, it means that something's evolved and it'll be buried there somewhere else. But there will be a link to it. And it's a paper that is called Nowhere to Go But Left, Using Narrative Theory to Resuscitate the Moderate Republican. In that video, which was something that I gave, a paper that I presented at the Southern Political Science Association conference in January of 2014 in New Orleans, there will be a link there, as you'll see later, if you can't find it anywhere else. But that paper talks about this hierarchical power and the power of homogeneity when the competition is this heterogeneous small groups type of, traditionally not powerful, but now we hope to make them powerful type of small groups. So that's enough on that. The narrative communities is where I've spent a lot of my work, and there's a ton of material on the webpage about narrative communities. The idea of a narrative community is that it has to have a sustaining institution. Max Weber wrote in 1905, and I think it was republished in 1930, a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The sustaining institution for capitalism is a narrative. When you think about it, it's a narrative that has, as Max Weber highlighted, it's a narrative that has as a sustaining institution Protestantism, because the Protestants, according to Weber, wanted this loophole to be rich and still get into heaven, because the way that Christianity has traditionally been understood is that a rich man, it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. And so the Protestants created this loophole that says, you know what, God's going to reward hard work and ingenuity, and if we dedicate ourselves and get rich, then that's not a bad thing. That's a wealth that God would approve of. The other kinds of wealth God doesn't approve of. And God also doesn't approve of people who don't work hard. And so we have this sustaining institution of Protestantism and capitalism mixed together in this toxic soup that says, you know what, not even God will reward lazy people, so we don't have to care for them either. And so it's this whole social Darwinism is intrinsically connected to the idea of a sustaining institution that says hard work is a very Christian ethic to have. And so we have these sustaining institutions that keep this narrative alive. So we call this a narrative community, and it's an interpretive monopoly that says, you know what, nobody can disagree with this because this is a capital T truth. And so if you disagree with this, we'll put you into this outgroup down here, and if you want to if you stick with the narrative, this interpretive monopoly of a narrative, then you get to stay in this sustaining then the sustaining institution allows you to belong to the in-group. And so this is that narrative community diagram, which I'll come back to often. So that's how narrative communities come into there. And what happens with hegemony, especially, is that you may get people through these sustaining institutions and these narratives, you may get people to actually consent to their own oppression, which is what Marx was actually talking about when he said that workers may come to believe that their work should contribute to the accumulation of private property by others, whom they may see as more fortunate and even more deserving. So that was Denhart's interpretation of Marx, that this is the hegemonic narrative actually is so powerful and so self-sustaining as its own narrative, and the sustaining institution is almost permanent now, that you can convince people to consent to their own oppression, and that's a real victory. And so that's why we're going to study narratives. And the way we study narratives is through this diagram, and we'll come back to this diagram multiple times. But for right now, just recognize this diagram as something that is part and parcel of the MOCSIE systems. It's actually the very brain of the MOCSIE systems. And it works with micro-narrative communities and meta-narrative communities. And it works in these kind of policy domains, which you see here, these 6 policy domains that are ways of capturing policy conversations and policy narratives. So let's talk about these sustaining institutions a little bit more. Joan Walsh, in her book, What's the Matter with White People, the subtitle of the book, I love it, it says, Why We Long for a Golden Age That Never Was. And that's the power of a narrative. Joan Walsh captures this, but it's also the power of a sustaining institution that drove this narrative and kept perpetuating it, where there was no truth to even back it up. And she talks about this idea that changes in the 1960s were pitting Americans against one another politically in new and destructive ways, while economically everyone fell behind except the wealthy. And then she talks about the sustaining institutions. Right-wing culture warriors blamed the decline. So here's the sustaining institution. We've got a capital T truth, and if we're not abiding by that capital T truth, then somebody else is to blame. We have to put the blame on this outgroup. Who is the outgroup? Well, right-wing culture warriors blamed the decline on the moral shortcomings of other Americans, the black, the feminists, the gays, the immigrants, and union members. So other people are the ones that are taking away this golden age that we had. We long for this golden age. But the truth is, the golden age never really existed. It was this ethereal utopian ideal which we talked about. The narrative spoke of this golden age, but it really was never, it wasn't real. It was intangible. It was just an idea. It was a narrative. And that's the power of narrative theory here. And that's why we have to understand that. So now let's talk about the pragmatic libertarian and how this is building the MOCSIE vision. So we've been building on this idea of this highly compounded problem. And the idea is that representation, for a pragmatic libertarian, representative government is not working. Representative democracy is a figment of our imagination. It's one of those golden age ideals that we talk about in narratives, but in actual truth it's not working. It's not representative because there's this inherent flaw that if you are one of these outgroups, then the narratives allow us to discount you. If you're poor, it's because you're lazy. If you are marginalized by your gender orientation, it's because you've chosen a lifestyle. If you are a female and earning 77 cents on the dollar on average compared to a male worker doing the same work, it's because we have had this moral decline in America where women don't value their role, and they've been listening to progressive ideals which are destroying the family. And a woman should be fine with 77 cents on the dollar for her wages because her first role is to family and children and husband. So where's a libertarian to go in this environment? If we have libertarians don't really worry about these moral shortcomings that Joan Walsh talked about, the culture warriors are fighting for. They want everybody to have little government in their lives and little government influence in their lives. So where are the libertarians to go? And this is a very important role that we're going to come back to later as we talk about the political motives behind the MOCSIE systems. So this virtual reality and complexity theory, this is the capstone of the MOCSIE systems theoretical development. If you're going to have small groups, infinite number of small groups, and if you understand power and how you can claim legitimate power to these small groups, and if you can manipulate the narratives that are your enemy rather than the people who are your enemy, and that's the important part of this whole MOCSIE systems theory, is that people are not our enemy in progressive government. If you want to advance progressive ideals, progressive policy, the people are not your enemy. You need those people on your side, but you need to use narrative theory so that these people understand that they are, in many cases, consenting to their own oppression. So then we have to understand the sustaining institutions, which is where this power is actually manipulated. Power exists by itself, but sustaining institutions protect that power through the narratives. And so that's why all of this builds onto itself. And then if you get the idea of a pragmatic libertarian, that is the power of people who are homeless at this point in time, and politically. Not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Libertarians really are finding themselves homeless. And so if the progressive ideals, and this is where we're going to get to when we get down to the bottom here, if progressive ideals can actually find a home for these pragmatic libertarians, then we are hopefully going to create a new moderate middle. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. But in order to bring all of this together, and in order to claim legitimate power, we need this new institution. And that new institution, I'm arguing with my theoretical development here, is a virtual institution. We don't have to build a new party if we build a brain for this kind of thinking, and to actually give these new narratives and these small groups the kind of traction that they have. We can use technology to do that. With the understanding that we've progressed all the way through section A here, let me finish up here talking about these virtual organizations, this idea of a virtual institution. And complexity theory really gets into play here, because at some point, when you create this brain, which I'm going to be talking about in the next section, all we've done is created a mechanism for people to gather. How people actually use that mechanism is completely unknown at this point in time, which is why we kind of work with the complexity theory on this project here. But I've done a video, once again in December of 2012, I presented a paper at the International Conference on Information Systems, and as part of the Journal of Virtual Worlds research, sponsored a mini conference, a mini track. And so I presented this paper here. There's 3 videos that go about that. And keep in mind, this is December of 2012 when I shot this video, and the theoretical development was still germinating at that point in time. So some of the things that you watch in these videos are significantly updated at this point in time, but these 3 videos will tell you a lot about where my ideas go. And it talks about 3D, 3C. So 3D is three-dimensional, of course, but the 3C is something that Yeshua Sivan has been researching. He's the managing editor of the Journal of Virtual Worlds Research. But the 3Cs are all very much embedded into this organization which we talk about. And in section B, we're going to talk about the system development, and this is really where I got the cart before the horse. I started developing a system. I knew something was needed to improve the sustainability for activist efforts. In 2011, Time magazine named the protester the person of the year, and it was because of the Occupy Wall Street protests that came at the last of it. But it started with the Arab Spring, and then it moved through the European Union austerity protests that started in Greece and spread through Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and other countries as well. And so the idea that those protests, those were narratives for change. Really what started out of those protests was an effort to build narratives for change. But they were not sustainable. As soon as the disruption took place, everybody said, oh, okay, yeah, we've had this disruption, and now let's have this conversation. And so winter came along and everything died down. And so the idea started and that was in 2011. I started my PhD program in September of 2011, right when the Occupy protests were in full swing. And so the ideas that have come out of this were to create a system that would give those protest narratives sustainability, and that was the technological development that I did, and that was really where I got the cart before the horse. And so let's go through this section B one piece at a time here. Remember, we can follow along in the bar at the top. And so what I would like you to do is think about institutional memory. In the Occupy movement, they had what they called circle time every day, most of it 3 o'clock. And so everybody would sit around in a circle in the public square that they were occupying, and they would have conversations. And every one of the protest groups had their own webpage, and they had their own bloggers, and they had all of this multimedia out there, and they were accumulating massive amounts of multimedia to their own little Occupy movement. And so as a researcher, I wanted to look up what was happening in Oakland, which was getting all the press. But what was happening in Miami? Miami wasn't getting any press unless you actually went looking for it. You couldn't find it. And so they didn't have this central core institutional memory. And we were talking, now we've got back to the idea of these infinite number of small groups, because that's what the Occupy movement was really good at, and the European austerity protests and the Arab Spring as well had all of these small groups, and they were finding consensus among themselves. But there was no way for these, and I call them micro-narrative communities, there was no way for these micro-narratives to percolate up and become meta-narratives, because the conversations were stored in such a way that they just stayed in these tiny micro-narrative communities, and everybody felt good about themselves at the end of the day, and nobody else cared. And as a researcher, I couldn't find all of this. The institutional memory idea which I came up with is that if you could store all of these conversations, if this digital media could be archived in a way that others could retrieve it, like myself as a researcher, like a journalist who wants to report about it, like a governing body who is working on policy proposals, viable policy proposals. Where do these viable policy proposals, how do they percolate upward? Well, if you have them based on the policy that they are, each one of these records, we'll call them ideographs. In the database we call them records, but in narrative, when you're talking about discourse structuration, you talk about ideographs, and this is a principle which Hugh Miller put forward. And so these ideographic records can be archived in 2 different ways. Number one, what kind of media? There's 6 different genres of media here, which I've identified. So it would be archived based on whether it was video, whether it was writing, whether it was a blog, whether it was pictures, photographic archives. Theater is a wonderful activist medium. And so all of these ideas, song, there's tons of activist songs, and so all of these different mechanisms, these genres of recording this in medium, the medium in which it is recorded, all of it digitalized, of course, and then the policy narratives. And so I've categorized all of policy objectives into 6 different campaigns as well. And so these records in this institutional memory are designed to be recorded in this way, and there's papers presented on this, and we'll get into that. So the technological development which I got into are started really much, very much in Portugal in September of 2012. I went to a conference, and this is the conference here. It's linked on my webpage. If you follow on the webpage, you'll see my picture here, and there's a link there to all of my publications and my conference presentations. So if you click on conference presentations and my publications, this one here is the printed record of my paper which I presented at Mediterranean Conference on Information Systems. And that really gets into the granular detail about this idea. But once again, it's a September of 2012 publication, so things have come a long ways from that period in time. But it talks about this database and the algorithms, and it talks in detail about that and how it goes and how you can derive down to through the digital media as it gets from the base categorization, the basic 6 categories, moves through the database down to the point where actually you find the record, the ideographic record. But these are sorting mechanisms so that the ideas can percolate back upwards again as you put together policy proposals. And so same way it sorts down through the policy mechanisms. And so the idea is to make these records, this institutional memory, both useful and usable, so that you can get back out all of the records that you put in narrative threads. And that's what so these are individual records when you get out here, but the narrative threads all percolate back up to one of the 6 policy proposals or one of the 6 genres of artistic creativity. So this digital media in the 6 genres, a little bit more about that. I presented a conference, Cyber 8, the conference on cyber cultures, was held in Prague, Czech Republic. And there's 2 videos, part 1 and part 2, that talk about how these records are used, these ideographic records. and about how they can be, how they're archived, and then how they percolate back upwards as they support policy proposals. Microenterprise and business support, once again, this idea from Yesha Sivana, and his research talks about 3D, 3C. The 3D, of course, is three-dimensional, and 3C. And the idea of creating a virtual world requires commerce, it requires community, and it requires, and at the very root of it is this creativity. It needs to foster that creativity. So as we've talked about in our previous section A, it starts with these small, infinite number of small consensus building groups, and that's a community. And we talk about the digital media, which is the creativity, and then we talk about the commerce, and that's what we're talking about here in section B5, is the idea that this is a self-sustaining institution. And number one, because of the small groups, it's self-governing and self-administering, and because of the creativity, we've got all of this creativity that's just percolating around, trying to get out 751 cities in 2011, on that weekend of November 12th and 13th, were being creative and putting together policy proposals, viable policy proposals. They just archived them and put them into this institutional memory, which had no mechanism for retrieval. And if you build together this community where this artistic creativity is rewarded with traffic on a web domain, then everything becomes, at that point, monetized. As we've already seen, the proven model is that wherever there is traffic, you have an audience. Wherever there is an audience, you have commodity, and wherever you have a commodity, there is a potential cash flow. And so the idea that we can make this self-sustaining and self-funding is actually integral to this whole idea. So if we return back up to section A and we talked about the virtual reality, this institution that has commerce, community, and creativity, but doesn't have a home anywhere, exists globally. It exists outside of government. It exists outside of geographic boundaries and political boundaries. It just exists because it has the institutional memory. It has a brain. And this is what Gareth Morgan talks about in his research, is the idea that if you create a brain, then that brain becomes the glue that holds the entire institution together. And if there is a cash flow out of that, if you can monetize it and make it into a self-sustaining institution, then nobody has control over it, except for these small consensus building groups that actually give it life. And that's where the whole technological development comes from. So now we're on to section C, the transformational leader in organizational behavior. What kind of a person put together all 751 city-based protests on the weekend of November 12th and 13th? Who is that person that's at the center of that protest? Who brought the idea together to say, you know what, let's create a new kind of community, let's have a conversation? Well, what's missing currently out of representative government is that mechanism that says, you know what, we value those individuals. You know, politicians today call those rabble-rousers part of the problem, because they're never satisfied. They need to allow government to work its course. Well, government has never worked its course for them. That's why they're protesting. The gay and lesbian community has protested because they have never had their recognition. But they're the youngest protest group when you talk about the civil rights organization. Women have been protesting since the 1830s, and African Americans especially have been protesting since they haven't had any rights since the beginning of the founding of the New World, ever since the white man took it away from the Indian. And speaking of another one, the Native Americans have never had any rights. So who's representing them? These are minority groups that have never had representative government, because the idea of representative government is that if you can win an election, then the person who was representing the largest group that got him elected or her elected is representing that base, that political base, and that's why we call them the base. So what about these small consensus building groups of protesters? Who represents them? Well, nobody at this point in time. And so that's what Ali Farazman, he is my dissertation chair here at Florida Atlantic University, he's been writing on this with a group, but there's about 15 of them that are throughout the world that have been talking about this. And so finally last year he got a publication through that is entitled, Can We Go Home? So he talks about how we've tried for the last 3 decades, we've tried this proliferation of eclectic choices, many unsuited for organizational effectiveness, but beneficial to powerful interest groups and politicians, all at the expense of alternative organizational choices and broad-based public interests. So he says, you know what, we tried all of this, it's failed. Trickle-down economics didn't work, deregulation didn't work, predatory capitalism has taken control of the globe. It really has reached the point where predatory capitalism manipulates governments now for their interests. And so what Dr. Frozman is saying, let's go home. Let's go back 3 decades ago. And coincidentally, not coincidentally, that's when Frederick Thayer was writing his work about these small consensus building groups. So let's go back home and let's start looking again at a new kind of an institution. So thinking back about this idea of taking a wrong turn, or can we go home? It would imply that we took a wrong turn. And so one of the papers that I did a couple of years ago as a homework assignment, as a writing assignment, was on this idea of John Rawls, who also wrote in 1973, the same year as Frederick Thayer. And John Rawls' theory of justice was the idea that there had to be an equilibrium between absolute rampant run-amok liberty and absolute equality on the top end of the scale here. So the idea that too much equality is a bad thing and too much liberty is a bad thing. And so there's this equilibrium in the middle. If we look at the history of the Americas, we've gone up and down in the United States. But we had this great society movement in the 1950s and 1960s when we passed civil rights legislation and the Voting Rights Act. And it looked like we were really reaching that point where even for African Americans, who I did a separate line for them, but everybody was trying to find this equilibrium, but it made a lot of people afraid. And so in 1968, the United States took a very different turn, and in my opinion and in my research, it was a turn away from this equilibrium and back towards rampant run-amok liberty. And Dr. Frozman's theory has also held true for this as well. He supported this idea that trickle-down economics did not work. Deregulation did not work. What it did was it paved the way for predatory capitalism. So predatory capitalism has taken us down back to where we haven't been for generations in the United States. And that's the argument. And so that's what this diagram here is all about. So what does all of this mean? Well, what it means is in the 1970s, we had all of these authors over here who were writing and telling us, hey, we've taken a wrong turn. Don't do this. This would be a mistake. And so that's what Dr. Frozman is saying. Can we go home? So when we look at the next diagram here, we need to understand part of this transformational leader and creating a transformational leader and understanding a little bit more about organizational behavior. We need to understand bias and pluralism, because bias is threatened by pluralism. People who have a bigoted view of the world are threatened by pluralism. And so I've done a paper on that. That's very much what this paper was about that I did at the Southern Political Science Association conference in New Orleans in January 2014. Was about, it had a whole section on mobilization of bias and what that means and how sustaining institutions do that mobilization of bias, how they're effective at it, and they protect these interpretive monopolies. So I would refer you to that paper, which was, once again, it's on the web page here at this link off of the landing page, the home page at MOCSIE.com. You can find this link then. The title of that paper again was "There's Nowhere to Go But Left, Using Narrative Theory to Resuscitate the Moderate Republican." And because we've gone so far to the right that libertarians haven't got anywhere to go, moderate Republicans are finding themselves a little abandoned as well. And so we can work and manipulate that system so that we can create something between the left and the right where we have new emergent narrative communities, and that's what that video is about. So we need to have leadership in the metaverse. When we talked about in the previous section A about the virtual reality and the complexity theory ideas and creating a new kind of an institution, the idea that we need leadership in the metaverse comes forward as a critically important idea, critically important concept. Remember, the metaverse is that space between virtual reality and the real world where we live now. At that interface between total virtual systems and brick and mortar systems, we have this metaverse. And so to have that kind of a leadership role, we need to train a new different kind of leader. And that's what this paper is about as well. Once again, I refer you back for a lot of the video on that about the virtual reality systems and the augmented reality systems to the paper that I did in December 2012 at the Augmented Reality at ISIS conference, sponsored by the Journal of Virtual Worlds Research and Yesha Sivan. So those 3 videos are there, and I would encourage you to take the time to watch those. So now we talk about this certification programs. If we're going to create transformational leadership and organizational behavior in a new institution, how do we train those people? What kind of training does it look like? Well, this was one of the first papers that I actually ever did. I was an undergraduate doing my bachelor's degree in multimedia journalism when I came up with the idea that we need somebody who has 6 unique skills that have never been aggregated before in a single person. And so this juggler person would have a unique kind of training. I called it social entrepreneurship, but then I found out that social entrepreneurship has been co-opted to mean way too many things, and so I just simply referred back to it as the juggler, a person who can juggle 6 tasks and responsibilities in a capacity where nobody else has really tried to bring them together in one person before. And so this diagram, which I've been working through from A to B in 4 sections and all of these units and modules, is kind of a syllabus. And this virtual organization, which came up as one of my models. What would an organization look like if it didn't have political boundaries, if it didn't have geographical boundaries, and if it was going to cater to these 951 cities in 82 countries? And it's not going to be restricted by hierarchical power. Any existing power in the world we need to create an institution that's going to be resilient to predatory capitalist elites coming in and taking it over. So it can't be easily co-opted by existing structures in the universe or the world. And so this organization here is this virtual world where there's no hierarchy, everybody exists on layers, everything's done in small consensus building groups, an almost infinite number of small consensus building groups, as Frederick Thayer said. So the interaction of these groups is over on this side of this institutional model. But on this side here we have what I call virtual university. It's the training organization. It's where professors meet with students and where very highly specialized courses are taught and where people can come and be educated and be trained so that these leaders within these 951 city-based organizations have proper training on how to use institutional memory, how to upload their digital media and their creativity and their policy supporting ideals, and then how to access them and pull them out as narrative threads so that they support policy change and the agenda setting process. And so it all becomes very important in a public administration standpoint to have this information available, but to have it put into this database in a way that it's properly archived so that it can be retrieved in these policy supporting narrative threads. And that's what's really important about this whole concept here, and that's where these certification programs would take place, is in this virtual university where people like myself from anywhere in the world can train individuals, can put together a course idea and offer it and have it work towards supporting a brand new kind of institution where there's no hierarchy. Okay, we're on section D now of the 4-part video series that is comprising this complete overview of the engineering and development of the MOCSIE systems. Section D is about the purely political elements of the MOCSIE systems. What have we put together in sections A, B, and C that would support a political machine, for lack of a better word? And once again, this is going to be a political machine that is resilient to hierarchical power and not easily co-opted by elite organizations or elite individuals, and self-supporting, self-sustaining, self-administering, and where it sustains a new kind of an institution that is developing narratives for policy change, progressive policy ideals, which come about as a result of the infinite number of small groups that are put together here so that they can change the way governing happens, and so that representative democracies truly become representative rather than just in name only. So the policy change ideals come about as a result of these 6 policy campaigns. Now if you notice down here, these policy campaigns are on the bottom half of this institutional memory, this circle here is a representation of institutional memory. And once again, following Gareth Morgan's ideal of how an institution can be germinated around a brain and function like a brain. This becomes the brain. So the bottom half of it is all about policy campaigns. The policy supporting narratives are germinated on the bottom half. And the search mechanisms and the algorithms that bring back these records, which we remember are called ideographs, the retrieval mechanism, so that they come up and percolate to the center core in 6 broad campaigns that are still very unified on what they are going to do and what they are meant to accomplish in these 6 campaigns of living opportunity. So what are we going to do to create opportunity? That comes in policy campaign number 1. Living color is about ending racism and racial bigotry. Living healthy is about ideals that contribute to the quality of life, the environment. Animal rights activism would come into there. The seniors, the babies, individuals. Living women is about creating equality for women and overcoming centuries and centuries of oppression of women. And so they accumulate and aggregate together in one campaign. Living diverse is about LGBT issues and about appreciating pluralism, so that we end especially religious-based bigotry. And living peacefully is about ending war and hate. So the 6 campaigns are put together here on the bottom half of this brain. And that's where policy change germinates and comes together. Once again, these are on other works of mine, and this is one area where a lot more interdisciplinary work needs to be done. And we'll get into that in the coming sections here. So as you can see by those 6 campaigns, this is a very heterogeneous network. We're not all about Christian fundamentalism. So when you have Christian fundamentalism as a campaign, the groups are already very homogeneous. Nobody needs to bring them together because they've had a sustaining institution for this large organization that is centuries old. And so all of the narratives are in there to protect itself as a sustaining institution. So nobody has to go in there and do it because it's been very homogeneous. The idea that a heterogeneous network is less effective is something which a lot of my writing is about. And Sandstrom and Carlson in particular talked about homogeneous networks being more efficient. Being more effective. So the policy ideals that come out of a heterogeneous network are more effective at solving the wicked problems of society. But homogeneous networks are more efficient because everybody already is reading from the same, singing from the same hymn book. So the idea of how to bring heterogeneous networks and make them efficient as well as effective is what a lot of my writing is about now, and that's where I'm at now. To do that, I created this diagram to illustrate what, in my opinion, is one of the stark differences between the political right and the political left. And so looking at this frontwards like you are, on the left-hand side, we have these heterogeneous policy networks. And a lot of people have said, Democrats fall in love. Yeah, we love the idea of peace, we love the idea of world peace, we love the idea of protecting the environment, we love the idea of protecting our animals and farming responsibly. And all of these dozens of heterogeneous groups are together, and so nobody is really singing from the same hymn book, but we do love each other, and none of us are really against any of these other ideas, because on the left we don't have a problem with pluralism. Pluralism is fine with us. We don't have a capital T truth traditionally, but by the same token, we're not homogeneous by any stretch of the imagination, whereas on the political right, a lot of homogeneity exists out there. On the far end, we have the tinfoil hat delusionists. They're all singing from the same page. Government is bad, and any government is bad. We need anarchy, and it's all about liberty. If you remember from the John Rawls scale of equality versus liberty, the tinfoil hat crowd want absolute liberty so that the absolute powerful rule everything. And we also have the religious right, of course, and so we have this homogeneous side on the political right and the heterogeneous side on the left, which we have to worry about. And then we have independent swing voters in the middle. So this is about, remember, very back at the beginning of Section A, we talked about the ultimate power is the power to win an election. So if you look at the political spectrum, what are we going to do to bring together this heterogeneous network on the left so that we vote as a policy block And when we're all about all of these different policies. So that's what this is about here, and we have these dialogic narrative communities that we need to deal with, and we need to bring them together, and that's what this institutional memory is meant to do. The algorithms within this institutional memory are meant to bring all of these groups together. The heterogeneous networks, which we have down here, are all about policy networks, which I talked about, and they're on the bottom half. These sustaining institutions are what we have on this second row out from the middle of the brain. And so we've created within this institutional memory a sustaining institution for heterogeneous networks. And that's about all I can say on that here. Let's move on to the social psychology element of it. I have a son who is a PhD student in social psychology, and Peter Leavitt is his name. But he and I, he tells me a lot of things. He doesn't get into this because it's very outside of what he's doing, but as one little element of this grand scheme of things, my son has been an incredibly valuable resource to me. And so I try and understand social psychology on this as part of my capstone class for my bachelor's degree in multimedia journalism. My assignment was to create a multimedia blog, and I created a blog called The White Guy on MLK Boulevard. I came up, I was given that name by several people who knew me because I was an activist already working in the gay community, and I was also working in the inner city community. And so at my husband's encouragement, and like I said, Mickey is African American, I got more involved and more deeply involved in doing outreach in the inner city communities. And so as part of my capstone project, I started doing research into the 5 major MLK boulevards in South Florida. There's actually 15 of them, but 5 of them were very significant. And so as I got into this multimedia capstone project for my bachelor's degree, I started to analyze these avenues, these MLK boulevards, based on a 3-legged stool metaphor. And the 3-legged stool is the zero-sum thinking, the just war mentality, and the complicity of other individuals who are allowing this zero-sum thinking and just war mentality to continue. And why would they do that? Well, they would do that because they enjoy white privilege. White privilege doesn't exist if any one of these 3 stools get knocked out from under the platform. Any of these 3 legs get knocked out from under the stool, the stool can't stand anymore. So complicity is really important when you talk about social psychology, because people who are complicit, who enjoy it, white, male, heterosexual Christians in particular, just as an example, there's several other ways to look at it, but that's one way to look at it. There is no more privileged class of people in the United States than a white, male, heterosexual Christian. And so if those individuals as a privileged class do nothing and nothing changes, that's pretty much all they have to do is do nothing, and their life stays in a privileged state. And so that's really important to think about. And there's as part of one of the papers that I've done, it's a common thread that's through just about all of my papers. But how do you change that? How do you end that complicity so that the stool falls over? If you take that one leg out called complicity, well, you do that by contact hypothesis. And this is something Gordon Allport wrote about in 1954, because he saw the Brown versus Board of Education decision as a major milestone in the United States. And as a social psychologist, he said, what can we do now that schools are being integrated? How can we overcome that? Because his research showed that it wasn't going to happen by itself. So this contact hypothesis started to be formulated in the 1950s, and it's been advanced very rapidly now, and it's become something which is which we see happening on a regular basis in the gay community as same-sex marriage becomes a debate. As people, 32% of everybody who has been studied over the past year said that they changed their mind about same-sex marriage, about marriage equality, because they know somebody who is gay. But racism isn't ending for that same reason. Prejudice is reduced by finding equal status contact in the pursuit of common goals, enhanced if sanctioned by institutions, and demonstrates common interests and common humanity. And you look at the fight for equality for women, and there's enormous resistance against these points. And if you look at equality for the races, minority races, the resistance is even more monumental. But if you look at the resistance about same-sex marriage and marriage equality, those barriers are breaking down. And my husband and I did a paper together, and the link to that is on the webpage as well. And what we did was we compared whether our mothers would have ever met. Because Mickey's mother, Ernestine, was raised in Muncie, Indiana, in a essentially segregated community. It was in Indiana, which is pretty much like the South exported to the North. My mother was raised in a Mormon community in southern Alberta, Canada, established by my great-great-great-grandfather, who was a polygamous Mormon with 3 wives and 26 children. So I was raised in a small farming community where 65 out of 120 kids in my graduating class were my cousins. Definitely a homogeneous community. Ernestine, Mickey's mother, was raised in a black neighborhood of Muncie, Indiana. They went swimming in a black swimming pool. They sat in the mezzanine at the theater. And they just knew to sit at the back of the bus, even though they didn't have to. There wasn't any written code. It wasn't Jim Crow laws. But they just knew to sit in the back of the bus because their lives would be easier. So how do you overcome this in a social psychology perspective? And so this is embedded in a lot of my writing, and it's a common theme, like I mentioned. Aronson, Wilson, and Akert are the authors which I use now, one of the most accepted textbooks in social psychology. And so they expanded Alport's 4 points of contact hypothesis into 6. And so there's a video out there co-presented by Mickey and I. We did that paper at the Public Administration Theory Network conference in San Francisco in May and June 1st of 2013. And I would refer you to that, which is also on the landing page of the homepage, one of the 3 videos. But what we talk about in there, about social psychology, and the main thrust of that video is the idea that narratives can be seen from a performative view or with an ostensive view. The ostensive view is like setting a table. If you set the dining room table and walk out of the room, when you come back again in an hour, in a day, in a month, the table is still set. That's an ostensive view. Christianity and all religions pretty much take an ostensive view. The book was written 2,000 years ago, and we have to abide by it because it can't be changed. It's an ostensive view. But no, it's a narrative. There are 41,000 different sects of Christianity. So which one of those 41,000 is the correct version? Because if it's an ostensive view of Christianity, 40,999 of those sects have to be wrong, and one of them got it right. That's an ostensive view, and that's how foolish it is to take an ostensive view. Whereas if you take a performative view and everything is a small t truth, what you have is, this is my version of Christianity. This is my path to God. You can have a different path to God, and I'm fine with that. But to take that is a threatening to an ostensive view. So being gay as a lifestyle choice is the example which Mickey and I used, as well as several others. We used a narrative in our paper about how people view women, equality for women, and how people view race-based issues, and how people view the issue of being gay. If gay is a lifestyle choice, and if that is an interpretive monopoly where it's an ostensive view, then people choose to be gay, and they could just as easily choose not to be gay. So they're choosing to live a sinful lifestyle rather than living authentically as the way they were born. Whereas as a performative view, if we as a gay community can get more people to understand people are born gay, and therefore it is a civil right for them to have all of the benefits of heterosexuals, then marriage equality all of a sudden becomes the accepted law of the land. But like I said, that's a worldview threat for those who take an ostensive view of narratives. So that's where social psychology comes in, and this is where narrative communities come in. And if you look at the one video, what we have to do is we can't, this narrative community over here that says people are born gay cannot attack and deconstruct this narrative community over here, because it's got centuries built up of resistance to that. And so the sustaining institutions know how to take on any attacks that would deconstruct their narrative. So the only hope is to create an emergent narrative community where we have a shared premise between these two communities. And the emergent narrative community goes forward, allowing them to have their history, while finding a new path forward where everybody is recognized and where there's new laws, and where there's new ways of saying the new narratives for living and coexisting. And that's why we have the idea of Flora and Ernestine in the video which we did, our mothers, their favorite flower was the lilac. So if you can create a contact between individuals where they find a shared premise, such as a favorite flower, or the fact that their sons are both gay, or the fact that their sons got married, then they have this emergent narrative community, and all of a sudden a woman, an African American woman born in the 1920s and in the 1910s, can become very fast friends with a white woman who was born in a highly homogeneous community in the 1920s. And they find this emergent narrative community going forward. And that's why we use the idea of their favorite flower was the lilac. So that's the social psychology. And we have to do that, and we can do that through meta-narrative communities. If we can create, if we find these larger conversations which people have, not highly specific micro-narratives, but these meta-narrative communities, if we bring them together, then we can create at this level contact opportunities between groups who traditionally do not see each other, see eye to eye with each other, especially when the performative view is seen as a worldview threat on an ostensive view of their world. So the terror management theory comes into play here. Remember we talked about the Max Weber book about the Protestant work ethic and capitalism. We've now got a problem with predatory capitalism taking over, even more powerful than governments in some countries, and where capitalist corporate elites can actually manipulate government in small countries, well, even big countries like the United States. We see a lot of manipulation. The lobbying groups are very, very powerful and well funded because they are supported by elite organizations. So, and they've got the hegemony on their side as well. The hegemon, we can call these global elite the hegemon. The hegemony is on their side. It's been centuries of thinking where, since Marx's time, workers have come to believe that their work should contribute to the accumulation of private property by others and whom they see as more fortunate and even more deserving. That's a hegemonic narrative that says, you know what, I was just born into this station in my life. I'm going to consent to my own oppression. This terror management theory comes into play there when you start breaking people out of this mold, especially when it's Protestantism merged with capitalism, and the idea that not even God will reward poor people. It's this idea that, oh, okay, well, I don't have to respect poor people. I don't have to do anything for them because my God says that I'm going to get into heaven if I work harder, and they're not going to get into heaven, and so I'm better than them. And so this terror management theory is, what is my reward in heaven? Who defined the afterlife for these individuals? And what do they have to do on this earth in order to have the rewards that have been promised them in heaven? And when you start attacking that worldview where they've got everything made up in their mind about how they're going to work their way into heaven and what they have to do in order to deserve these rewards in the afterlife, then any attack on their sustaining institution has to be defended vigorously. And winning elections is no longer important to these individuals, because what's more important than winning an election is the reward after this life. And that's where terror management theory kicks in. And so you have to wonder who's behind the cross. When people can be manipulated that easily with religion, I mean, really, all you would have to do to bring peace to the Middle East is have all of the groups that sit down and agree that everybody has their own path to God. The Sunnis have a path to God, and that's fine. Take your path to God. But let the Shiites also have their path to God. It's a different path to God, but they're going to get to their God, and you get to your God. And let's just respect each other and not try and kill each other. And so if the Christians and the Jews and the Islamists and every other world religion for that matter just agrees to have a performative view of narratives, then we've got world peace. At least we can bring an end to religious wars. So who's hiding behind the cross? The power of non-decision is something that Bachrach and Baratz wrote about in 1962. Who benefits more than Christian fundamentalists when change is stalled out? So if you can manipulate Christian fundamentalists or other world religions for that matter. If you are an elite, wealthy individual and you don't want any change because things are working very well for you, thank you very much. So let's stop change. Who do you have to get on your side? Well, in the United States, you can hide behind the cross and just get the Christian fundamentalists on your side, and they will work vigorously in campaigns because all you have to do is protect their Christian narrative, which means no change. We don't have to allow gay marriage. And if it's a Protestant work ethic, we don't have to really help out the poor other than give them, you know, the noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobles. Let's throw charity through churches at these individuals, but we can't establish church. We can't establish government charity because that fosters laziness. If we allow the charity to happen through our church, then that means we as a tiny little community get to determine who's the deserving poor, and the undeserving poor get to be excluded. So that's why they want to do this. And they call it the privatization of and the socialization of conflict. That's a Schatzsnyder principle, which I also get into here as well. So terror management theory says who's going to react to a worldview threat. And so we have these three groups that I've identified on my little drawing here that will react very strongly to a worldview threat. So all you have to do is make them afraid. They will write you checks. They will come out and support your campaigns and your elections. And all you have to do is tell them through media campaigns that change is bad and we can protect this ostensive view and pluralism is bad. And so that's what happens, and that's how terror management theory is abused, because it mobilizes bias. It is so effective at mobilizing bias, and you'll have people react very quickly, very strongly, and give you lots of money. And that's where media theory comes in. So if the elite own all of the mainstream media, I remember when I was studying in my bachelor's degree, there were 6 global media organizations that pretty much dominated all of the mainstream media, and 6 corporations. So when you look at media theory, you have to think, oh, okay, who is controlling the mainstream media, and can we even use it effectively? And the answer is probably no, and that's why this institutional memory becomes very important. So that's the top half of this brain here, is this idea of how do we, as a new institution up here, remember the infinite number of small consensus building groups, how can we control our media so that we get to construct the discourse rather than allow others to construct the discourse. So this idea of discourse structuration becomes very important, and you do that through an algorithm of this database and how the ideographs are stored and how they are retrieved. So you put them in so that they're easily accessed as digital records, and you pull them out in narrative threads to support policy change. And you make them very, very powerful, and you make them very compelling, and that's what ideographs are all about. And so that's part of this instruction, and that's part of what we need to teach the juggler. And that's also how we win elections. So we get down to the very final point here. If we put all of this together, all 4 sections, and if we train the juggler how to do all of this, then we've got this mechanism of building a new kind of coalition for winning elections. And that doesn't matter in the United States or Canada or any other country of the world. The political left and the political right have their analogies, and we can talk about the left and the right. Left traditionally being big government, socialism, conjuring up ideas of communism if you get too far left, and the religious right conjuring up ideas of religious extremism if you get too far to the right. So we're going to talk specifically now about the small government libertarians and the new economy progressives. The new economy progressives are saying, you know what, traditional government isn't working for us. So if we have this political spectrum, which we always think of as left and right on a plane, as a flat plane, if you think of it as a curving arc, when you reach far left and when you reach far right, what you can do is you can start coming back together on another level where traditional government is not working. So if you're not going to go back to traditional government, where do you go? Well, you just keep going around, and we have this driving force that traditional government is not offering us a solution to society's social equity challenges. And that's where the small government libertarians can maybe find some common ground with the new economy progressives. So we have this moderate middle now. The moderate middle who likes traditional government is going to vote as a middle independent swing voter. And the collective government pragmatic libertarians, who are a coalition between this new economy idea and the libertarians, comes together and have another political independent middle moderate here as well. And so we move back to the center away from these extremes, and that's the whole theory of winning elections. It all starts with training, and the certification programs starts with building a new kind of an institution. And that's really what this is about. And so that brings us back to the juggler. And I use the example of bell hooks because a social entrepreneur is this kind of a person who's committed enough, and they have this passion. And all they need is a little bit of direction. And if we can give them that direction and train them in these 6 broad areas, then you've got this person who's capable of leading a new kind of an institution, one that's based on small consensus building groups of 5 or 6 individuals where they make decisions and they're collaborative, and then we build a technological mechanism to bring them together into a global institution that spans all governments and spans all geographical boundaries, and big enough and broad enough to include all kinds of progressive ideas, not just narrow little economic ideas, but ideas about all elements of living together in this planet. Then we've got this idea where we can create that new institution. And browse around the webpage and send me an email. I would be delighted to start correspondence with you and get you involved and show you what you can do. Thanks.